All right, so we are going to talk a little bit about argumentation, that how arguments are crafted, how we can look at an argument, how we can pull apart an argument. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the documents we've already looked at, one by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the book Emile, and the other one from the Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft. All right, so as we think about an argument in writing, arguments have four components to it in order for it to be a really strong argument. So the first part is a claim, which is the debatable statement, a counterclaim, which is a claim that negates that original claim, evidence, which is what you use to sort of support your claim, and the reasoning, which shows your process of thinking. How did you draw a judgment or conclusion about what you said? So here's an example of sort of some real life claims, counterclaims, evidence, and reasoning. High school should have a closed campus with the exception of seniors. So that's a claim. It's a debatable, arguable statement. The counterclaim to that might be high school should have an equitable policy. If they close campus, it should be for everyone. So that talks sort of to, okay, you should close campus, but it needs to be equitable. Evidence, high school seniors are older, more mature, and are recognized as closer to adulthood. So that's my evidence, but I need to show my reasoning behind that. So because seniors legally have the right to get a driver's license, society sees them as closer to adulthood, so they would have more rights and responsibilities. So that's kind of the components of an argument in a nutshell. So let's look at how these two people crafted arguments about how they believed women and men should be educated. All right, so let's look at Rousseau and the excerpt from his book Emile. He says, "This habitual restraint produces a docility which women require all her life for long, for she will always be in subjugation to a man or a man's judgment." So it sounds like he's saying women should be docile, and because they will always be kind of under the power and control of men. And she will never be free to set her own opinion above his. What is most wanted in a woman is gentleness. So she really shouldn't have her own opinions, and so she should just play the gentle card. She should become kind and docile. A man, unless he's a perfect monster, will sooner or later yield to his wife's gentleness, and the victory will be hers. Okay, so he kind of says there's sort of this agreement that if women are gentle and kind and kind of know their place, he'll eventually kind of do what he needs to do, and everybody will get along just fine. So then he says, once it's demonstrated that men and women neither are nor and should not be constituted the same, okay, so he's basically saying men and women are not the same, and he's saying either in character or in temperament, so in how we're hardwired or how we behave, it follows that they should not have the same education. So boys and girls should not have the same education. Boys want movement and noise, drums, tops, toy carts. Okay, so boys want boy toys, and girls prefer things which appeal to the eye and can be used for dressing up: mirrors, jewelry, finery, and especially dolls. So girls should be playing with toys that are sort of traditionally thought of as girl toys. They should be playing dress up and playing with dolls. And he goes on to say, the doll is the girl's special plaything. This shows her instinctive bent towards life's work. Oh wow, so a doll is going to prepare a woman for her role in her life. So if you're playing with dolls, I'm guessing he's thinking they should be good mothers and have children. Little girls always dislike to learn to read and write. Oh wow, little girls don't want to learn how to read and write. And he goes on to say, but they are always ready to learn to sew. So the search for abstract and speculative truths, for principles and axioms in science, for all that tends to wide generalizations, is beyond a woman's grasp. So he's saying we shouldn't be teaching women to read and write. We should be teaching them to sew, and then he talks about abstract and speculative truths for principles and axioms in science. It sounds like he's talking about some scientific thinking or philosophical thinking, and he says that is beyond a woman's grasp. So even if we did teach women that, they probably wouldn't be capable of really understanding that. All right, so Rousseau's got some pretty strong feelings about education and women. So let's actually pull apart the pieces of the argument. So how we feel about it really doesn't matter. What we want to look at right now is how is Rousseau structuring this argument. So first thing we look for is that claim. So what's that statement that really is what is sort of the whole argument is structured on. And what I landed on is the statement about once it's demonstrated that men and women neither are nor and should not be constituted the same either in character or in temperament, it follows that they should not have the same education. So he's basically saying that's the crux of his argument. So in this particular excerpt of Rousseau, there really isn't a counterclaim. So let's just go looking at the evidence he uses. And what he talks about really is he pulls on this idea that boys and girls have specific characteristics. And if we nurture those specific characteristics, boys playing with toy carts, which are kind of the car of the era, and girls playing dress up and playing with dolls, then we're basically preparing them for their roles later in life. And so he uses all of this evidence that boys and girls are different. And he infuses his reasoning in. So if you look at the pieces that we've underlined, he's talking about really because boys want movement and noise and drums, and because girls are sort of more inclined to play with dolls and they're more instinctively better around dolls, that those characteristics, those sort of inherent traits, are really kind of what make boys and girls what they are. And so therefore we need to make sure we're educating them so that they go into life really having developed those characteristics. All right, so let's look at Mary Wollstonecraft, because she has an idea as well about the education of women. And she wrote this piece in response to Rousseau. And she says, "What opinion are we to form of a system of education when the author says, 'Educate women like men, and the more they resemble our sex, the less power will they have over us'?" So she's talking about if we have a system of education like this, where men are educated for manly things and girls are educated for girly things, she's not sure about that. She says, "This very point I am at. I do not wish them to have power over men, but over themselves." So she's saying we need to empower people to kind of think for themselves. And the most perfect education, in my opinion, is to enable the individual attain such habits of virtue as will render it independent. In fact, it is a farce to call any being whose virtues do not result from the exercise of its own reason. So when I look at the words habits of virtue, and independence, it seems like she's really saying when people can think independently and reason independently, really that is kind of an actualized, strong human being. So she goes on to say, "This was Rousseau's opinion respecting men. I extend it to women. To reason on Rousseau's ground, if men did attain a degree of perfection of mind when his body arrived at maturity, it might be proper, in order to make a man and his wife one, that she should rely entirely on his understanding and the graceful ivy clasping the oak that supported it." So it sounds like she's thinking that Rousseau had this sort of idea that everyone in society would get along if we kind of knew our roles. So the men would be sort of these strong oaks and women would be this graceful ivy. And because everybody knew their roles, that things would just be great. And if we played to those roles, then society would be prosperous. So, but alas, husbands as well as their helpmates are often only overgrown children. Oh my goodness. So I guess she's saying husbands are just like having an extra kid around the house. Nay, thanks to early debauchery, scarcely men in their outward form. Oh my goodness. Debauchery is kind of a word around not being very responsible and behaving, kind of like going out partying and being irresponsible. So it looks like she's saying men are basically not equals to women. And if the blind lead the blind, one need not come from heaven to tell us the consequences. So she's saying if we don't educate women and we only got these men who are just kind of going out and being irresponsible, we aren't going to have a very good situation. So she goes on to say, to be a good mother, a woman must have this sense and that independence of mind which few women possess who are taught to depend entirely on their husbands. Meek wives, in general, are foolish mothers. Interesting. So she's saying if women are sort of timid and hauled back, they aren't necessarily very good partners. They're not good mothers. And she said she's looking at when she talks about if they're taught to depend entirely on their husbands, that's not a very good situation. If children are to be educated to understand the true principle of patriotism, their mother must be a patriot. Oh my goodness. So she's saying that women are kind of the hub of the whole thing that society spins on. If you think about women being good mothers, those mothers, if they're good, are good, teaching their children to be good patriots, good thinkers, and that makes the society stronger. Interesting. Make women rational creatures and free citizens, and they will quickly become good wives and mothers. That is, if men do not neglect the duties of husbands and fathers. Wow, so she's got a very different opinion than Rousseau on this. Let's take a look at the argument. All right, so let's pull some of this apart. So in the purple, it looks like she is talking about, I do not wish them to have power over men, but over themselves. So I think she's talking more in terms of an argument around women need to be equal. It's not who's more powerful, it's how do we make everybody sort of their own person so that they can be the best they can be and become independent. So the green is her counterclaim. So basically she's taking things that Rousseau said and using them as the counterclaim. So she's kind of saying, well, this is what he said. He said, for example, educate women like men, and the more they resemble our sex, the less power will they have over us. This is the very point I'm at. So she's talking about, Rousseau is basically saying we shouldn't educate men and women the same because it becomes a power problem. And then she goes on to say, well, I don't think it's the power. I think it's more about how do we create individual, independent people. So you can see how those sorts of things, it's like she's giving a nod to one side and then giving her own opinion. And then the later piece is also a counterclaim that she's talking about. Rousseau is basically saying we need to understand our roles, and men need to be the strong oaks and women need to be the ivy around the oak tree, and that makes society as a whole better. But it kind of goes back to her claim that no, what's best is when everybody can think independently and everybody has a good education. So let's go back and look at what she says in terms of her evidence. So it looks like her evidence is, well, husbands are basically no better than an extra child around the house. And it looks like she says that women who aren't educated are not good wives because they depend too much on their husbands. And her third argument is really around patriotism, that if we want to have a strong country, women need to be rational, they need to be free citizens, and they need to be able to participate equally. All right, so we've looked at Wollstonecraft and we've looked at Rousseau and their arguments. And so what I'd like you to do is to do a quick write and email this to me. The first question is, how does the structure of an argument make what you are saying convincing? So if we go back and think about how these two people structured their arguments, what makes them convincing? What makes them believable? And then the second piece is, who has the more compelling argument and why? Let's get an exclamation point on there, or a question mark. So who has the most compelling argument? So even though we may not feel like we agree with Rousseau or Wollstonecraft, think about who has sort of the better argument and send an email to me about those things.